I think any sane economist can see and appreciate that what's happening in Greece is a tragedy of major proportions. I think of it as an experiment in gold standard economics, totally at odds with how modern economies and politics really works. So it's a return to a conception of economics and economic policy that barely worked in the 19th century. Is totally inappropriate for the 21st. It's really an exercise of bleeding the patient in the hope that it will recover. The tragedy, of course, is that it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. I think from the very start, the mistake was that German Chancellor Angela Merkel presented this crisis to her own constituents, her own electorate, German people, as a morality play of sorts. It was presented as a narrative that pitted Greek profligacy and Greek duplicity on the one hand against German thrift and German hard work. And I think this way of framing the crisis, I think, shaped a lot of the actions that followed. The right way of framing it, of course, was that this was a narrative of interdependence. It was a crisis created by the interaction of an incomplete process of integration within the Eurozone and an external financial shock of a magnitude that no one really could have foreseen. And that was really no fault of the Eurozone on its own. So the crisis was, as I said, a consequence of incomplete integration and also of inadequate regulation. So we had monetary and financial integration within the Eurozone, outran banking, fiscal, and ultimately political integration. Finance outran regulation and supervision. And these dual processes made the Eurozone very vulnerable. Now, to some extent, of course, an integration process of the type that the European Union and the Eurozone were engaged in is something that takes a very long period, period of decades, if not centuries. So I'm not a Euro critic who thinks that this was doomed to fail. But I think what the crisis did was raise the stakes and therefore presented European political leaders with a pressing choice that in order to save the euro, they would have to invest in the building of Eurozone-wide fiscal and political institutions and invest in building a truly European political community in a much more rapid way than what they had planned. Instead, the Germans and some of the other creditor nations chose the approach of teaching Greece a lesson. But in fact, this should not have been a morality play. After all, the German and the French banks that lent to Greece were as much at fault, as much to blame as the Greek government that built up the debt. This is not about apportioning blame. So while it is true that Greece had clearly engaged in fiscal excess, this was really made possible by excess on the part of financial intermediaries and lenders in the rest of the Eurozone. Now, I think the trouble with the program as it is at present is that essentially it contains no strategy for restarting a growth, no strategy for economic recovery. From the very beginning, the European Commission and the IMF have been deluding themselves by saying that this missing growth strategy or recovery strategy is provided by structural reforms. That structural reforms will will set off the kind of incentives that's required to recover the real economy. But the problem is that as much as Greece may need some of these structural reforms in the form of deregulation of the professions, opening up of markets, some privatization, one can argue, and many of these things might be quite desirable in some medium, long-term sense. The trouble is that such structural reforms do not do the job in the midst of a complete collapse of domestic demand. So they are at best ineffective and at worst harmful. No producer wants to hire workers or invest when they cannot sell what they produce. So when you're facing this critical overcapacity problem of shortage of demand, the supply side reforms are simply not going to get you the productivity increase that can act like anything like a recovery program. So by default, the implicit growth strategy in the present program turns out to be effectively a period of a sufficiently long depression and deflation that will ultimately, hopefully, restore competitiveness. By default, that seems to be the growth program in place. Now, we look at the IMF's most recent report on Greece. The IMF says that about half of the needed increase in competitiveness has been achieved. About half of the needed competitiveness has been restored. Now, Greece is at 27% unemployment today, youth unemployment at more than 60%. So if we extrapolate, one wonders about whether unemployment will have to reach 54%, double what it is now, and youth unemployment will have to reach 100% by the time that we actually restore full competitiveness. So the social, the political, and the economic consequences of this are unimaginable. And simply put, no country in the modern period has ever successfully come out of a debt crisis of this sort through these policies of deflation and austerity. So if Greece is not to experience a lost generation, an urgent change in strategy is required. First, with respect to domestic policies, I think one needs to be a recognition that fiscal austerity is disastrous if it doesn't come along with some other way of reviving domestic demand. So maybe Greece cannot afford to engage in fiscal Keynesianism, but there has to be some other way of reviving domestic demand. And the European Union can help here through EU-financed investments, EU-financed employment programs, other transfer programs that are going to finance Greece's fraying domestic safety nets. And that's important not just for social reasons, for reasons of social and political stability, but also because of Keynesian reasons, that giving people some money that they can spend is a way of preventing a downward spiral in demand and employment. Externally, I think there needs to be a recognition that rebalancing in the European Union needs action on the part of both Germany and the European Central Bank. That in Germany, an increase in wages and other policies to raise private consumption, to increase private expenditures and reduce Germany's trade surplus, to give other Eurozone countries a chance to compete. On the part of the ECB, an increase in the inflation target to make it easier for peripheral countries such as Greece to regain competitiveness. I think there is a bit of a relaxation due to the action of Mario Draghi last summer to underwrite sovereign bonds. And that action by Draghi has calmed financial markets because it has taken away the possibility of a sovereign bond meltdown. But it has done absolutely nothing to correct the real problems and the real imbalances of the Eurozone. You know, one of the upsides for Greece in a way is that Greece is not alone. Greece may be the worst in terms of the economic difficulties that it faces, but it is in some company. The problem obviously is extended to Spain, to Portugal, Cyprus, Ireland, Italy, and now increasingly France as well. The newest numbers that have come out about Eurozone growth for 2013 suggest that this is the economic decline is becoming quite a general one that also threatens now to drag as well into the quagmire in a major way. You can imagine Greece and even a country like Spain being bailed out. But when it comes to countries like Italy and France, these countries are simply too large to be bailed out. So perhaps a greater realization that this is not just a Greek problem, that this is a problem that's dragging the entire Eurozone down, if one wanted to be optimistic, may lead German policymakers and others to change their tune on austerity. But if there is no change of that tune, I'm afraid that Europe is in for a continued period of economic decline, rising unemployment, and political acrimony within the Union, which will be a real tragedy, since I think the European Union was truly the greatest achievement of international cooperation of the last 60 years.